Now let me introduce Stu Henderson. Stu, take it away.
Thanks, Lisa. I'd like to talk today about compliance because a lot of the times we talk about compliance without really knowing what it means or why we're doing it or how do we tell how well we're doing it. So we're going to talk about some simple approaches, some things to help you understand compliance and deal with it more effectively. We're going to do this in three sections. We'll start with a little introduction and history. Then once we've got that under our belt, we'll list some of the big key concepts. We'll wrap it up with a summary and a call to action. So imagine you're a CIO, it's been a long week, you're ready to go home, you get in the elevator, you're heading down, and the elevator door opens and there is the CEO. And he says, "Oh, hi, how are you? Say, are we in compliance?" Well, I've got a couple of questions to think about here. The first one is, why is this an improper question? We'll talk about that in a moment. We'll talk about the ways that the CIO can respond to this question. And then just to tie it up, we'll talk about why is the CEO bothering to ask such an irritating question? Well, first, here's the reason why it's an improper question. If you talk about compliance and you don't say compliance with what, it's an incomplete sentence. So are we in compliance with company policy, with the fire code, financial regulations? I don't need to read this stuff to you. The last one is something else. There's always new standards and new regulations coming along, whether it's for credit card processing with PCI or California is coming out with some new privacy and security ones in the near future. So if you don't say compliance with what, it really is a meaningless question. So here's some things to think about for a good response. First, it's better if you answer the question before it gets asked. If you happen to run into, have to rely on chance encounters to manage your relationship with your boss, well, it's better off if you don't. You want it to be comprehensive, specific, believable. You need to address the cost-benefit issue. We'll talk about some things to think about that. And a really key item here is identifying who is responsible. So let's talk about some possible responses in the light of what we've just been looking at, in the light of these good response characteristics. So the CEO says, "Well, are we in compliance?" And the CIO says, "Well, yes." Well, you can see I wouldn't be comfortable with that. Suppose the CEO says, "Well, are we in compliance?" And the CIO says, "Well, the auditors say we're SOX compliant." Still not comfortable. So the CEO says, "Well, are we in compliance?" And the CIO says, "Oh, I'm hiring some consultants that are going to get me that answer." I'm still not comfortable. I hope you aren't. CEO says, "Well, are we in compliance?" And the CIO says, "Well, IT's different. We don't have to be compliant because, we're just different from those other parts of the organization." I'm very uncomfortable with that. Or the CEO says, "Compliant," or says, are we compliant?" And the CIO comes back and says, "Compliant with what?" Maybe the CEO is expecting the CIO to answer that question instead of pushing it back at him. So let's try another response that might make us more comfortable. The CEO says, "Are we in compliance?" And the CIO says, "I've asked legal and compliance, and they tell me that we have 27 sets of regulations we have to comply with. I've added my own 28th, a government-provided guideline for effective IT security, and my people have tailored it to meet our situation because, those government guidelines don't always match real life." Continuing, "I've also put one of my best managers in charge of identifying the details for each of these standards. So for each of these 28 now standards, this manager is going to address each of the specific requirements and tell me any area where we don't meet the standard." Now, I'm discovering this is a whole lot of work, so I'm automating this as much as possible because it'll be more accurate and likely cost us less money. And just to get an overall desk check of how well we're doing in our compliance program, I've asked the auditors to comment on how effective we are. Well, that's a better answer, I think, and you can see some of the things we're going to be talking about for the remainder of this presentation. The reason the CEO is asking this question is he's concerned if we have any instances of non-compliance, depending on what they are and how serious they could hurt profits, embarrass the firm, or so on. I don't need to read the rest of that to you. Some basic things often get overlooked when we talk about compliance. The first is how much it costs. The second is how difficult it is to do because we now have so many different standards and regulations. And just identifying all the requirements and standards is a major effort in itself. And we're going to pick up on organizational issues shortly because matching the responsibility with the authority, if you ask who's responsible for compliance in our organization, if you don't know who that person is, in many organizations, well, it's nobody or it defaults to somebody, but it's not formally thought out, and sometimes that person doesn't get the authority that's needed to do the job well. And adequate resources. We'll talk about some of the resources you need in just a moment. So here's some history just to put this in context. Back in the last century, when we first started using mainframe computers, compliance wasn't an issue. And then auditors started applying their checklists, and sometimes they'd use Windows-based checklists to audit the mainframe computer, but that was the best they could come up with in some cases. And then we had some cases like Enron, and in response to that, Congress passed Sarbanes-Oxley. And then there were more breaches, more incidents, more regulation. GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations in Europe. Records retention. I was once working for a brokerage firm, and someone got really mad at me. He must have been because my punishment was he put me in charge of records retention. So I went down the hall to the legal department and said, well, what are the records retention requirements? And he said, oh, well, the federal government has these requirements for the Internal Revenue Service. And I said, oh, good. Well, then that's just that one set of requirements. And he said, well, no, in addition to the federal government, each of the 50 states that has income tax also has their own set of regulations for records retention. And I said, oh, well, then it's just 51 sets of regulations. And he said, well, no, actually, because of the Securities and Exchange Commission, we're a brokerage firm, has their own set of regulations. And yes, each state has its own. So I now had 102 sets of regulations to deal with. We're getting more government, we're getting more standards, we're getting more regulations. I wish we didn't, but it's coming at us, so we need to deal with it. Some conclusions we can draw from this. First, there are a lot of installations that spend a lot of resources on compliance, and they don't get effective security, and they don't really get compliance. But they've got lots of paperwork if anyone wants to ask. And sometimes the amount of paperwork could be just outrageous. Second conclusion, it's meaningless to talk about compliance without answering the question, with what? And sometimes common sense is the with what. Third conclusion, a lot of the problems we have addressing compliance are organizational. If it's not clear whose job it is to ensure compliance, whose job it is to monitor compliance, and so on. And in many shops that I see, the mainframe security administrator, by default, is made responsible for all of these without being given adequate authority or resources or knowledge. Cost is a major issue. Looking at scope, if you look at compliance just on the mainframe or just on our distributed boxes, you're going to miss the point. Almost every one of us has an enterprise that includes mainframes, Unix computers, Windows computers, very often all of it interconnected and all of it connected to the internet. To be effective, You have to look at the whole picture as well as at each component. Next conclusion. We have to be prepared in case there is some incident of serious non-compliance. We need to have a plan, public relations, legal, human resources, compliance, marketing, IT, and finance, and other departments. Every one of these should be ready to respond if someone says, hey, wait a minute, we've got, our company is in the headlines of the newspaper because of some incident that was the result of us not being in compliance. How are we going to respond? If you don't have that ready, and if it's not clear who declares a non-compliance incident as being serious and decides to activate whatever plans we have, we won't be ready when it happens. Better to be prepared up front. Overall, you need to look at the cost and benefit, because there are a lot of cases where, well, maybe there's some cases where non-compliance isn't a big deal. I mean, what's the penalty? What would it cost us if we just somehow didn't get around to doing something? Now, the marketing department may have their own opinions because they've got stuff for their marketing strategy that might be important to them, that might not be the subject to some specific regulation, but we need to get their opinion on this. How much are we willing to mitigate the risk? Basic understanding of risks and the cost of mitigating the risks and how much risk is left over is a basic part of being a manager. And associated with all of that is seeing how much we're budgeting for this, how much we're spending on it, and are all of the efforts we're making for compliance, are they really being spent on reducing the risk? And are they doing it in a cost-effective fashion?